Recently, pollsters like Nate Silver, the editor-in-chief of 538, have found that even if Biden wins the popular vote by a significant amount, the election would still be considered a toss-up. This discrepancy comes down to the Electoral College.
The Constitution was created, it creates the 3/5 clause, right? This argumentation that representation is based on population in states, especially in the House. Same thing with electors, right? So each state is, the number of electors they get in the Electoral College is based on population. And the Constitution says that slaves count as 3/5 of an individual, meaning that for purposes of representation, slave states would be able to count their slaves as part of that population vote. So they would get more electors, even though slaves weren't allowed to vote in those elections.
Historically, it was created to give votes to states with smaller populations, and that was the intention that the founders had. But I think over time, what we've seen is that it's kind of disenfranchised voters in populous states like California, New York.
There's some countries like Madagascar and Trinidad that still have the Electoral College, but most of the major democratic powers like Canada, the UK, and France, none of them use the Electoral College. So I see no reason for us to be using it, especially if they don't have any benefits to our citizens.
Despite its history, many on the right claim that the Electoral College is still essential in modern-day politics. The usual arguments come down to the weight of small states and potential voter fraud.
To be made that the Electoral College discourages fraud, mostly because when you look at kind of voter fraud, it disincentivizes it in a large number of places. If you're looking at Wyoming, for example, right? There's 3 electorates there. There's not really much of an incentive to commit voter fraud in Wyoming. Whereas if you get rid of the Electoral College, votes in Wyoming matter the same as anywhere else, and then you have to be much more cautious.
The Electoral College has become a partisan issue, though, as discrepancies between the Electoral College and popular vote seem to favor Republican candidates. But why exactly is that?
At the end of the day, politicians only care about staying in power, and the Republicans only want to keep the Electoral College just so that they can stay in power.
Once again, we're talking about population density, and there is a lot more population people living in the democratic states. And so, but the way the Electoral College is set up, the small states that often vote Republican or vote red will also have a decent amount of power in their hands, even if they have less, a smaller density of people living there. So their vote might overtake the more democratic states.
A lot of times the main arguments against the Electoral College comes down to this idea of making sure one person equals one vote, right? Because especially for us in California, right? Why should Wyoming is one of the lowest population states. It gets 3 electoral votes because the electorates are based on representation in Congress, and Senate demands that they have 2. Right? So they have 3 electors. They get to choose, 1 for House of Representatives, 2 for Senate. But because of that disparity, right? Because they have to have 3, even though their population doesn't match that, basically means that a vote in Wyoming is worth 8 votes in California.
In 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2.1%, but Trump still managed to have an electoral victory of 304 to 227. Democrats fear that this pattern will repeat itself in 2020.
In the beginning, when Trump ran, he was always talking about how the current system was a disaster, but afterwards he was always talking about how the Electoral College was better for the United States. But I don't think that's true. This is silencing so many people's votes, because even if there's one more person, if it was even and one extra person voted for Biden, it should be with the majority. And the fact that Biden needs to win by so many points in order to be guaranteed a spot in the White House is insane.
If he doesn't win in a landslide, it'll be very difficult, because if it's just a matter of percentage points, I think the Republicans will play the voter fraud card, and it would be really hard for a Biden administration to come into power and there to be trust in the government. So I think that especially given this high voter turnout, I hopefully believe that you'll see a Biden landslide. But if that's not there, it's just a function of you have to change the Electoral College. This has just gotten to a point where it's a tipping point, or if you have like 5-6 million people more voting for one side, even if they're just in these like localized states, it doesn't matter. Like obviously they're still citizens and their voice should still be heard. And I think that if there's such a high discrepancy, there has to be something that has to be done.